Good morning and welcome to Toronto Police Headquarters. Today we have Homicide Detective Sergeant Hank Idsinga, who will provide media an update into the Bruce McArthur investigation.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. As you know, on January the 18th, Bruce McArthur was arrested. He has been charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder in relation to the deaths of Selim Esen, Andrew Kinsman, Soroush Mahmudi, Dean Lisowick, Majeed Kayhan, Skandaraj Navaratnam, and Abdulbasir Faizi. One of the focuses of the investigation has been on human remains found within planters from Mallory Crescent. I have previously stated that the remains of at least 7 individuals have been located within these planters. The remains of Andrew Kinsman, Soroush Mahmudi, Skandaraj Navaratnam, Selim Esen, Dean Lisowick, and Abdulbasir Faizi had previously been identified. One set of remains had been unidentified. I can now report that the remains have been identified as Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. Mr. Kanagaratnam arrived in Canada in 2010 from Sri Lanka and lived in the Scarborough area of Toronto. He was not on file as missing, and we have no prior evidence which would link him to the gay village. We believe that Mr. Kanagaratnam was murdered between the time period of September 3rd to December 14th, 2015. Mr. Kanagaratnam was born in 1978 and would have been 37 years old at the time of his murder. Mr. Kanagaratnam is the male depicted in the previously released John Doe photograph. The identification was confirmed with assistance from an international government agency. Today, Mr. McArthur was brought back before the courts. He was charged with first-degree murder in relation to Mr. Kanagaratnam. Bruce McArthur is now charged with and alleged to have committed 8 murders. I really want to take the time today to acknowledge the work of the officers on Project Prism. We knew that eventually they would get the job done and would identify this 8th victim. The stress and anxiety over dealing with hundreds of tips, hundreds of missing person occurrences, and dozens of potential identifications for the 8th victim has been enormous. While we are saddened, we are also tremendously proud and relieved to have been able to bring closure to the friends and family of Mr. Kanagaratnam and the 7 other victims. I want to thank those who have come forward with their tips. If anyone has not heard from us or they have information related to Mr. McArthur, please call us at the Homicide Squad or anonymously through Crime Stoppers.
Detective Sergeant Idsinga, when you say you were able to identify him with the help of an international agency, can you elaborate?
I can't. I'm not going to say which mechanism we've utilized. I have stated in the past that we've used fingerprints, DNA, and dental records to identify these victims, and that's as specific as I can get.
You said that he wasn't reported missing, but you're happy to bring closure to his family. Can you comment on what his family's reaction was to this? Like, were they wondering why he lost contact over the years? Was it, like, what have they been feeling over the years, and what was their reaction to this news?
We're still dealing with the family and getting as much information as we can from them. The family, the direct family, is not in Canada, and we've had to utilize a Tamil-speaking officer to get some information. We're still working on that, so we're getting more and more into the background of how long he's been missing and what their reaction was to that.
Where did those photos come from?
Sorry?
Where did the photo come from?
Again, as I've said before, I'm not going to specify exactly where that photograph came from.
Where are dates from? Do you have the dates from 2015? There was like a...
Sorry, hang on.
Sorry.
Where is he from?
He's from Sri Lanka.
How long was he in Toronto?
On the information today, you also mentioned that there's a period in which you believe he was murdered. How did you come to that period?
I can't speak to that. There's some records that we have which have helped us narrow that time period down, but I can't get specific about what those records are. He was not one of the 22 tips, no.
removal?
It did.
Detective, can you just talk about the victim's history in Canada? Was he a resident or a citizen, or how long had he been here?
I'm not going to speak specifically to his status in Canada. I will say that he came to Canada from Sri Lanka in 2010.
Okay, you said that, so he's not one of the 22 tips, but last week you were talking about being cautiously optimistic about one of those 22. This is not that one then.
Correct.
And so can you just tell us what happened between the time of your news conference, which was last, Tuesday or Wednesday, and then Thursday when you identified him? Did something happen very quickly at that point? Because I thought it took a while to get the DNA confirmation anyway.
Well, again, I'm not going to speak specifically about what mechanism we utilized to identify Mr. Kanagaratnam, but I will say it was just some very diligent, good police work by some of the officers assigned to PRISM, doing some follow-up, and they managed to come through with this identification.
Was he on your radar before last Wednesday?
No.
He's never been reported missing by anyone, either in 2010 or either in the last year or so. Never reported missing at all.
He was not on file in Canada as missing, and I'm going to leave it at that. We're still following up on
Does he have any
specifics.
family in Canada?
That he wasn't or hasn't been at this point connected to the village. What does that say to you?
I don't know yet. He doesn't quite fit the profile that we've seen before. Even with Mr. Lisowick, we didn't have any direct connection right off the bat, but eventually we did find a connection. Whether that comes true with Mr. Kanagaratnam or not, I just don't know yet.
How is that victim came in contact?
From Sri Lanka, does that tell you anything specifically? Is there anything you can delineate from that?
Not really, no.
Was he a refugee here that may have had his application denied?
Again, I'm not going to comment on his immigration status here.
Did
What
you
do you
have,
believe that he came in contact with Bruce McArthur?
We don't know.
did you have any family here?
He had some, not direct family, but some distant family,
Like
yes.
cousins, that sort of thing?
Yes,
In the GTA?
in the GTA,
Did he
yes.
have an online dating profile at all that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Were you able to get some help from that family within the GTA? Like that could help you with a DNA profile, right?
It could. I wouldn't want to rely on a distant cousin for a DNA profile, but that could potentially help us, yes.
Detective Sergeant, do you believe this victim and any others were stabbed to death, or do you believe they were choked to death? We ask only because someone that may have known this individual believes the family has been told he was stabbed to death, and is that important in the investigation as far as past cases for MOs?
I don't have that information. I don't know where the family would have come into possession of that information.
Other than telling us he's 37 and he's from Scarborough and moved here in 2010, what else can you tell us about this victim?
That's about all I can tell you about him right now. We've just identified him very recently. We've spent the weekend contacting family. We're working on more background, but that's all that we have right now.
Do you agree with the shelter system at all? Similar to Teamwork?
Not that we know of yet.
What does that mean for your investigation that, you've got members of the LGBTQ community involved in this, we have people who frequent the shelters involved, and now a completely different individual. How much larger of a net now does your investigation need to be possible?
Well, we're still working through any outstanding missing persons occurrence in Toronto. We're still working through quite a few cold cases, murder cases from Toronto. But obviously, you're right. This does create basically a wide open net. And we've had lots of calls, international calls, since our pleas began for people who just haven't seen family members in years. And I'll reiterate, if you have any information whatsoever that can help us out and somewhere that you'd like us to look, then give us a call and let us know about that. We can't have the information if people don't provide it to us.
You said last week that you had at least the remains of 7 people pulled from the planters. Do you still think that you might have the remains of more people, or do you think that you've identified all of the remains now?
I don't know yet. As I've stated before, these remains are dismembered. Actually putting these remains together and definitively linking one part of the remains to another is still a work in progress.
So is it puzzling to you that this last alleged victim that you've identified doesn't fit the profile of the others, that all had this connection to the village, even if some of them were leading a double life? At least we knew they had contacted McArthur through perhaps a gay app or dating site.
Well, it's like I said, it's definitely something that we're still looking at to see if we can make that connection. I don't know if we ever will, But the fact of the matter is that we do have his remains positively identified in the same planters as all the other victims. So,
Is this consistent, Detective Sergeant, with, there was a theory put out there, and I apologize if it wasn't you, but someone that he would, McArthur would allegedly look for people who would be less reported missing, perhaps less quickly, or had less ties to the community, perhaps victims who would be more isolated?
that's a possibility. I think there's enough information out there on the backgrounds of most of these individuals that people can draw their own conclusions on that. So whether it ever becomes an issue in court or not, I don't know.
You said it was a second burial site of some kind. Is that correct? That you identified all 7 of the, you identified 7 remains in the planters. That leaves one person whose remains is not there. Do you think there is a second location?
Well, I don't know if the remains of that one person are there or not. We're looking at more locations. We've got a lot of searches still to do. I stated last week, as the weather gets warmer, we are going to search more locations, and whether we find anything else or not, I just don't know yet.
Detective, in previous news conferences, you've talked about having to go further and further back in older and older cases. Can you just talk about that a little bit in terms of how far back are you looking, what kind of cold cases, what kind of missing persons reports are you looking at, what kind of timeline are you looking at?
Well, I said last week that we're looking at a series of cold cases from the 1970s. I believe the earliest one is 1975. There was a gentleman here last week who brought up some cases from 1967 and 1968. We're not looking at those ones. We're aware of them, but we're not looking at them. So right now, the furthest back we're going to is 1975.
What does your gut tell you, Detective Sergeant? Do you think there are going to be more victims?
Well, that's a great question. I think we've all seen in the media so-called experts who tell us that serial killers don't start in their late 50s and their 60s. But then again, if we listen to these experts, we'd be looking for a brown-skinned 35-year-old male, and that simply isn't the case, obviously. So harking back to what we said in 2013 and in late 2017, right now I have no evidence that would link Mr. McArthur to any murder earlier than Skandaraj Navaratnam's murder.
Do you think at some point you'll have to stop? At some point you have enough? I mean, or are you giving yourselves as investigators a time frame? You said at the end of the summer, early fall, at some point this has to go to trial.
The court process is underway. I've always felt that if we could get these remains identified and lay the charges relevant to those remains, that's a very good starting point, and we'll let the Crowns proceed with that. And if we start making links to historic cases and can establish reasonable and probable grounds on some historic cases, we'll probably keep that separate. I'll leave that decision up to the Crown attorneys. But obviously there's a process that's underway and it has to remain underway, and this set of evidence fits very nicely into that ongoing process. So,
What is going to be separated into chunks? Do you think this is enough to get a court case going and then continue to add charges as you go?
this is definitely enough to get a court case going, and whether I add further charges or not down the road depends on the circumstances of the other cases. If we discover we, in fact, have more than 7 remains and maybe have 8 remains within those planters and identify a 9th victim, then we may lay that charge. But if we start making links to the 1970s, like I said, we'll probably keep that separate.
What is it about those 70s charges, with 70s cases that makes you think they're related?
We have no evidence yet to think that they are related.
Why those not say not really anything before that? Is there a reason the cutoff only goes back to 75?
There's nothing in particular that makes that cutoff except for Mr. McArthur's age and his whereabouts.
What are the odds, in your opinion, what are the odds you're going to find something in the houses and the public spaces that you're going to investigate, come May or something like that? What are the odds? And as an experienced investigator, do you think that you're going to find something more?
I don't know.
How distressing is it to you that we've got yet another man who was never reported missing? This is the second of the alleged victims who just went undetected for all these years. Nobody even called the police. How does that make you feel as an investigator?
Well, it's very concerning. And obviously, there's a breakdown somewhere between international lines, and that's something we're going to look at over the next few days, is exactly what happened and why he wasn't on file as missing here in Toronto.
Elsewhere? Is your
Sorry?
brother missing in Sri Lanka, seen back in his home country?
Not that I know of, no.
Then what's the breakdown? I don't understand.
Sorry?
Then
What's
what
the
would the
breakdown of
breakdown be?
communication?
Between family, if they want in Sri Lanka, who perhaps want to report somebody missing in Toronto, and how can we facilitate that? If it wasn't facilitated, we just don't know yet. We're still
He was
working.
living here from 2010 on, so maybe they weren't in touch with him, or
Did
were
they
they
know
aware
that
that
he
he
was
was
here?
missing?
Again, we're still working on all that background.
If I had a report missing, do you have any idea if they?
That I don't know yet, Justin.
Was it a direct result of releasing those photos that led you to identifying this man?
I think it definitely helped.
Thanks,
With
everybody.
the cold cases, with this revelation and findings, does this mean perhaps you might need to look at more cold cases because he doesn't fit the profile of previous victims, alleged victims?
We're open to looking at anything. So,
Is it still
All
something
right.
about the missing person system that this many people go missing and so many of them didn't get the investigation that a missing person's case should get?
it very well might, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes today's news conference. A news release will go out shortly. I believe the photograph and the name will be attached to that news release.
Oh, you are? And do you know if